Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first work session on the transportation elements of the FY 21 to 26 CIP. Today we'll be mostly discussing road and bridge projects. Elements of the CIP involving pedestrian, bicycle, and transit projects will be discussed at our March 5th work session. And I say that knowing we just lost half our audience. The CIP, as recommended by the executive, contains a variety of projects that matter to our constituents, notably road resurfacing and maintenance of sidewalks, curbs, and street lighting. These are quality of life issues that affect all our residents no matter where they live. The CIP includes an increase of funding for bridge replacements thanks to relaxed standards for making many of our counties' bridge eligible for federal funding and saving the county money and reducing the number of deficient bridges statewide. While there are many of the executive's recommended CIP, many elements of it that I find appealing, look forward to working with my colleagues to identify areas where we should prioritize funding and make desired amendments. So with that, Dr. Orland.
I didn't know if the director wants to give an overview or if you'd like.
I do. Yes, please.
Go ahead,
Mr. Conklin. Welcome.
I was going to say hair director, but then I thought.
I didn't know you had opening.
Misunderstand that. Okay.
Conklin, anything?
No, just we're pleased to be here and discuss these priorities. As you mentioned, these are all important to us. State of good repair for our infrastructure is a leading priority to make sure that we can maintain access and safety. And as you mentioned, a lot of the pedestrian and bike items that are of critical note with Vision Zero and other programs are discussed next time. So hopefully we can come to agreement on many of these items and move forward.
Looking forward to it. Okay.
Okay. With that, just a little bit of an overview before we plunge into the projects. On page 2, you'll see in the top of the page how much money was programmed in the last CIP, that was amended CIP that approved last May by agency and by area within the county government compared to what the county executive is recommending now. You'll see that overall the new CIP is a little bit smaller than the amended CIP, primarily because we're going with slightly lower bond limits, as well as we're anticipating less in the way of impact tax revenue for both schools and transportation than had been in the past. And you talked about that in early February when we talked about spending affordability. In terms of the individual agencies and departments or areas of the CIP, transportation is probably down, next to general government projects, is probably down the most. It's down about 10% from what was in the amended CIP. Part of this is owing to the fact that FY 19 and 20 are no longer counted in the 6-year totals, and there are some big projects in there which are graduating out, if you will, like the Capitol Crescent Trail, a lot of that money, the Bethesda South Entrance project, the Maryland 55 BRAC project are getting closer to completion. And although there are projects and funding being added at the back end of the new CIP, it's not as much as what's been been just completed in 19 and 20. That's the explanation for a lot of this. Then you see in the bottom of page 2 a summary of how the DOT portion of the CIP splits amongst the 7 different areas that we've traditionally used. And you see the percentages there for each. They're not too different than what they have been in the past, although the mass transit figure is down quite a bit. A lot of that is because of the US 29 project is getting closer to completion and things like that. Pedestrian bikeways facilities is also down a lot, but that's having to do again with this Maryland 355 BRAC project, which is really both a hiker biker underpass as well as the new entrance to the metro station, but it's been lumped into the pedestrian bikeway program. If it's go one place or another, that's where it went. Again, that project is mostly finishing up, so that explains a lot of the reduction there, even though there are actually a lot of pedestrian bikeway funding being added by this by the county executive and his recommendation. I also want to point out something I'm always wanting to point out to folks, particularly with new folks on the council. You'll often hear from bikeway advocates and pedestrian advocates that we don't spend enough money on sidewalks and bikeways and that sort of thing. you can't just look at the pedestrian facilities bikeways program and say that's what we're funding, because there's actually a considerable amount of sidewalks and bikeways that are being paid for under other programs, particularly roads. And you'll see at in the table on page 3, there's about 6.5 miles of sidewalk and almost 9 miles of bikeway that are counted under the road program because they're ancillary to road projects, but they're actual sidewalks and bikeways being built. And then even with the facility planning transportation project, which really doesn't fall into any one of these areas, but for the sake of convenience, it's always fallen into the roads program. A good part of that program is for development of pedestrian bike projects as well as mass transit projects. And even the road projects being developed under that have bikeways and sidewalks in them. So it's just a way of basically alerting you to the fact that we're actually really doing a lot more than for sidewalks and bikeways than what the total there on the table on bottom of page 2 is describing. Other than that, the planning board, point out, did make a series of very lengthy comments on the transportation CIP, but virtually all of them had to do with pedestrian bikes and mass transit, so I didn't include it in this packet, but they will be in the next one. And as we go through each of those projects next week, I'll highlight what their recommendations are. So with that, I'm going to plunge into the bridge projects. And one of the things you'll see in the packets that I do for the CIP is for each category I have what I call consent projects. These are ones which there's really no change at all to the funding or the funding schedule or the timing schedule for the projects, and there's been no comments at the public hearing or by anybody in particular. So we sort of treat them like consent calendar. If you want to talk about any of them, raise your hands or speak now, and we can. But there's really nothing that, at least I have to add on this, other than just saying the project's on schedule. Project really hasn't changed, and otherwise I just move on to the next project. So I am recommending approval of the executive's recommendation on the 4 bridge projects, which I'm calling consent projects, which are listed on page 4, unless if that's okay. All right, with that objection. The next project is bridge design. Now here, this is the project where, excuse me, I'm going to have a lot of amphibians living in my throat this morning, this afternoon. This project has existed for a number of years, and what it does is it actually takes a proposed bridge rehabilitation and replacement project and carries it almost all the way to the end of design. And at that point, you really have a very good idea what the cost is of the project and the scope. And typically what happens is once the project's finished the bridge design, the executive comes back the very next CIP, and even in an off year he'll say, let's add the project construction cost to that. And it's usually at the front end of the CIP. In the past, really 20 years, went back and looked at my records, on average, we've only added about 1.5 studies per year. And the biggest year we added in the past was in 2006, we added 5 studies. The executive is actually asking for 21 new studies this year. It's a much, much bigger increase. Part of that has to do with the fact that there is a lot of federal aid that is available to the county, and federal aid pays a large portion, not all of it, but a large portion of bridge projects, particularly if they're 20 feet or long in span. And all the projects, the studies that the department wants to add, the executive wants to add, are ones that would be federally eligible. And there's 2 ways of looking at this. One is, in the past, what we've done is we've added 1 or 2 studies a year on average, and they'd be sort of in the middle years of the CIP, the monies would be programmed, but then every year they'd come back with a couple more, a couple more, a couple more. What he's doing here is kind of like what the executives did with the affordable housing PDF, where there, I guess it's the HIF project. I'm not sure which one. I'm a little bit beyond my ken here, but I think we've added $10 million a year in the first 2 years of the CIP and not programmed anything in the last 4. He's basically saying, well, if we know we're going to do $10 million a year, we might as well show $10 million a year in all 6. And that's sort of the same philosophy here. If we're going to be adding bridge design studies every year, let's go ahead and program the whole 6 years. This is still a more aggressive schedule, even taking that into account, But again, with the federal aid that's out there, and there always seems to be somewhat of a backlog with bridge rehabilitation, although not as bad as some other things, but bridge rehab and replacement is probably a higher priority than most things, given the alternative, what the consequences might be. I'm basically concurring with the executive. Even though the increase in cost is about $7 million over the 6-year period. Yeah.
All right, so I may need you to say that all again, but you're saying that this is the design funding, or is this,
Design.
this is just like a placeholder for the design funding, and, well, it's not a placeholder,
Well,
it's a
it's-
fund for the
yeah.
design funding, and in the past, we had typically budgeted for 2 years, is it the same, 2 years?
Now, we've typically added between 1 and 2 new design studies a year.
Yeah.
Again, some years a little bit more, some years none.
Right.
And again, the executive is asking for 21 more. And all of them, by the way, they're in the packet on circles 2 through 4, I think, lists all the bridges we're talking about. And near the bottom of Circle 2, you see where it says Schaefer Road Bridge. Everything sort of north of there on Circle 2 are ones that are already programmed for design. Actually, Gold Mine Road and Park Valley Road are long done. But Beach Drive Bridge down through Glen Road Bridge number 15 they're already in the CIP.
Was this creating a lot of designed bridges that then we have to fund for construction? They're not funded for construction?
Yes. But it's spread out over a number of years. It's going to be a more aggressive program in the future, given that there's going to be more projects going through design that will be ready to go to construction. That's right.
Why does it need to be ramped up? Why do we have to suddenly change our level of effort?
Well, we were made
Can we
available-
cross that bridge when we come to it, Mr. Conklin?
We were made aware about a year ago that we weren't taking full advantage
You're
of
welcome.
the
You're
federal aid available to us.
Here all week.
So we made a concerted effort to figure out how to program this and make sure that we're getting all of the federal aid that we can. And in the construction phase, there's also a lot of federal aid that supports that. It's a 2-to-1 program generally. So for every dollar we spend, we leverage $2 of state and federal aid. So we're trying to make sure that we get the full allotment of outside dollars into these programs. And that was the primary reason for this acceleration.
That is also, though, not a time-limited funding program. We could, you're trying to maximize the dollars now in the shorter term.
Well,
Those
eventually,
funding streams are always theoretically available?
there's some funding that's accumulated that hasn't been used, and we are concerned that the state would ultimately reallocate this elsewhere to locations that are accelerating their programs so that we wouldn't be able to take advantage of that money that hasn't been spent in the past.
What would be the expected timeline to have to replace these bridges?
Well, as Glenn mentioned, this is phased over the CIP, so then as each one reaches the end of that design phase, it would come to you as a project to consider whether to fund the construction of or not. And we would be prioritizing those based on the condition and the types of repairs needed. So it's not obligating you to construct them now, but the construction dollars, again, are a large federal state aid share. So this is over the entirety of the 6 years.
And in fact, it's
Some of that construction will fall well outside.
in fact, it's
the
even
6
beyond,
years.
right, it's even beyond that. If you look at the Circle 4,
It's like
the
a
last,
it's a surge of design funding.
yeah, it is. But if you look on Circle 4, you'll notice the design doesn't even start till fiscal year '23, and it goes out to at least FY '26, which means we probably won't see standalone PDFs for those until the next FY '27, beyond the 6-year period. So again, it's a way of trying to provide design funds over the 6 years. One of the things I should have said at the very beginning of the entire CIP review is, just so the general counsel on this kind of stuff, everything is subject to reconciliation at the end. And so you should, as you go along, I think, don't go hog wild, but if there's a priority you have, put it forward, and knowing that it might be delayed a bit or reduced a bit at reconciliation to make all the numbers fit. So if anything, I'd be a little more assertive, and even in something like this is pretty assertive in terms of the amount. But maybe at the end of reconciliation, we have to dial back this a bit. But it at least shows the direction you're going in. Instead of having maybe 2 or 3 studies and having 21 here, maybe it ends up being 14 or something. But we'll have to see how things fit at the end. But knowing that also in this project, more of the money is actually federal aid than it is county funds. So,
That was the point I was going to make.
Right.
Even at the design stage.
right, at the design stage.
Right.
And even in the construction, once the projects go to construction, these are all federal aid eligible projects. And so even then, when they go to into the CIP for construction, there's probably more federal aid in those bridges than the county funds. But nevertheless, it's still county money.
Right.
The increase in dollars you see isn't necessarily directly impacting the dollars available to other county priorities, because
Right.
a large portion of it's not county funds.
Right. I mean, that's can't be said often enough, I think. And we never go hog wild, we're always prudent. But
You are.
for everyone watching at home,
OMB laughing, by the way.
best stand-up audience around. It's true, Mr. Conklin, right, to Councilmember Reamer's point and anybody else who may be thinking this, we're not fixing and replacing bridges that don't need to be replaced, right? We have many, many bridges that have outlived their what's the functional use, functional life, functional use?
Functional sufficiency, their bridge sufficiency.
Sufficiency, that's right. And we've never been able to fund enough replacements for them. And we should be happy about the change in the guidelines, making more of the federal funds available, and we should be taking full advantage of that. We should be spending every federal dollar we can get our hands on and husbanding our own precious county dollars for other things, right?
Correct.
Isn't that so? Okay. So that's what we're doing here. And there's no logical reason absent besides our practice or the ineligibility that we had for some of these to access the federal funds before that. There's no reason we didn't fill out the full CIP with bridge projects in the past, right?
Actually, there was some workload gating of our implementation of this program in the past that we're
Right.
trying to get past.
Right.
So that we are taking full advantage of the funds that are available.
But yeah, I think this is only good news, that we're going to be able to repair bridges that have long needed repair in Montgomery County, and we're going to be using somebody else's money to do it.
Correct.
I think the public's going to be happy to hear that. Thank you.
Okay, is that unanimous, or?
Given my speech.
To take
Yes.
votes as I go along here.
I'm for it. I'm just saying, we got affordability issues, and so I appreciate your comment that we'll fund as much as we can. That's
Right.
really all I was also trying to say.
Bridge renovation, this is also an area where the executive is recommending a major increase. It's going basically from about $12 million to about $31 million over the 6-year period. And there's some specific emergency conditions happening at certain roads that are listed: Alderton, Turkey Branch Parkway, Clarksburg Road. But there are a lot of other deteriorating steel culverts around the county. We've had a couple major failures in the last couple of years. Roads that are going to be closed because the culvert collapsed and the road was washed out. And when that happens, the cost of rehabilitation is much larger than just replacing the culvert. So this is a way of trying to get ahead of that some more. And the sub-projects that are listed, although I recognize they're in extremely small print, are on Circle 6. So if your microscope out, you can read them. But those are the renovation projects that are planned over the next several years. So, okay. So that's unanimous. Item number 4.
Hold on one second.
Oh, sorry.
So, taking a look at Circle 6, of the, I can't do the quick counting, but of the dozen and a half or so projects, a lot of them are emergency and high, right? So clearly the need. And so taking a step back with what Dr. Orland said just about the rainfall and quite frankly, climate that has changed and making our community wetter, right? Talk to me about how that has necessitated, if it has, some of this increased budget or additional repairs.
Yeah, there are two components to that. One is there are many of these that we weren't aware of they were installed as part of development projects. They didn't get recorded in a database. So a few years ago, we went and did a concerted effort to improve the inventory and found many of these. And there are short-term repair strategies that can address the additional stresses from the rainfall you've mentioned. When those haven't been done, we've seen the failures and the essentially loss of the whole facility and having to make full-scale replacements. But the intention of this is to harden that infrastructure in place to repair the deterioration that we have in those facilities so that they can withstand the stresses that we're seeing on it and not have to go into the full replacements, which are either very impactful because a lot of these are single point of access to communities or on major facilities, and loss of those facilities like Father Hurley when that failed, and Belfast Drive earlier this year. People were unable to access their homes, and we had to do the work in a compressed time frame without the design and other attention that we would normally take. So this is a program to try to deal with the new stresses and avoid those negative outcomes that we've had with the failures.
Sure, I appreciate that. And the priority, the terminology regarding the priorities, the adjectives, emergency, high, critical, high, that they're all bad, right? They're all bad terms.
Yes.
How do you differentiate between them?
Emergency means that we are concerned that in a major rainfall event, we will lose the infrastructure that's there and have to do emergency repairs if this doesn't get programmed as we plan. The other one's the critical no detour, means that their sole point of access to a community, so that if we lose that facility, we are telling people they're walking through the woods.
That's what you were just referring to.
That's what I was just referring to. Some of these others are the repair strategies, like, or high is, probably not as critical as the other two. It's still an important facility to repair.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, item number 4, there's actually 4 new bridges that are including exec's recommendation for funding for rehabilitation and reconstruction. One of them, actually jumping down to number 6, is the Glen Road Bridge, and that has gone through facility planning, it's gone through bridge design and is ready to start. Land acquisition FY21, construction 22, great. But under number 4, there are 3 other projects, Brink Road, Fair Park Road, and Mackinac Road. All those bridges are still 4 years away before the design is completed. And so I think it's premature to include funding for those 3 projects in the CIP until the design is done. One of the questions, we've never done this before, we've actually programmed money for a project that hasn't even been designed. So I'm recommending not including those 3 in the CIP. Someone asked before, I hadn't done this until just now. That's about $15 million worth of bridge work amongst the 3. About $5 million of that is county funds, about $10 million is federal. Again, what I'm saying is that once the design's done, then they will come back to the council, sure, for funding. But until the design's done, we really don't know what the scope is, and we don't know what the cost is. These are guesstimates right at this point. So I'm recommending not.
The rationale for including these was to be more straightforward about the capacity that we could program for other purposes. So knowing that we would have to construct these after the design is complete, we wanted to make sure we were reserving that space in those years of the CIP, and also to demonstrate to our funding partners that we were committed to moving these forward when the design was completed. So that was the rationale for adding these. And Dr. Orland is right, it hasn't been the practice normally in the past to include them later in the CIP like this, but it is the way we think is more prudent to do it going forward.
And frankly, I can't remember, I've been doing this 30 years, I can't remember a time when the department and the executive has recommended a bridge project coming out of the bridge design project that hasn't been funded. It's almost always been, I think it's always been funded. And usually on schedule that's been recommended. So we look to that history to help support the argument that we're serious about this stuff.
How did we get away with not reassuring our funding partners in the past?
I think because we were actually underspending our obligated funds from the federal program. Again, as Chris mentioned, one of the concerns we have is, we have a lot of money sitting there, that has been obligated for us. This demonstrates to the state that, yes, we are preparing to use it and get ourselves positioned to be constantly spending at the appropriate amount. I think before we had there was no concern that we were underspending. The feds and the state were always telling us, if you don't spend it, we'll give it away to somebody else who can spend it. We'd actually prefer to be in a position where we're in a position to take and get somebody else's money that's the obligated.
I do remember a time about a decade ago, maybe a little more, where that was the situation. And in fact, we did have projects ready to go, and we were able to use that money that was not able to be used by other counties. So I think it's always a concern to have, but I think we're well positioned to be able to do that, particularly with the bridge design studies being funded the way they are. So,
As I mentioned, we were put on notice that we weren't using our full allocation of funds, and we have retooled this program to demonstrate that we're using all those funds.
Who put you on notice?
The State Highway Administration. And as I described, there was some workload-based gating of this work before that we tried to address and make sure that we're getting everything we're due.
Have you received some indication from our funding partners that if we weren't to keep this in here,
That notification was part of the state's notice to change. They changed how they program the federal aid. There used to be a separate bridge program and then also a separate roadway maintenance and system preservation project. The state has now taken all of those funds, or the feds distribute them collectively. The state has maintained it, so they took us through their process of how they're restructuring the program, really with the same amount designated for bridges, and reminded all the counties that if you don't actually use your obligation, you're subject to seeing it get reprogrammed to somebody else.
so
what do you think of that?
I'd stick by my recommendation.
All I would say is I don't think it's going to make a material difference in your deliberation, because we will need these funds, or approximately these funds, at the time we've asked for them, because that's when these designs will be completed.
But that could be said about a lot of projects, really. Again, until a project is designed, we don't know what the scope is, we don't know what the cost is, and at that point is when it's able to make a logical decision as to how much to set aside. And we've always been able to we always have the fiscal capacity to do these things. Maybe setting a different kind of precedent, which could apply to all kinds of projects, actually, not just bridge projects.
Mary Beck with OMB. I think while we've made the capacity, has not been easy. When we tend to have a very small set aside in the early years of the CIP, and frankly, when these projects present themselves, they're sort of must do. And so you think you have a $10 million set aside in the first year, and in fact, you really don't, because we have to do the bridges. So, I mean, the numbers aren't quite as precise. It is against the past practice. I think it's probably a better practice.
Gentlemen? I think I'm with the administration on this one. I know where he is first.
Okay, since no one's going to say something, I will. I support the administration. If there is additional money that's on the table, let's use it to fix our infrastructure.
Okay. Fine.
I'd rather not run any risk to go anywhere else. I like this approach.
And Mr. Rimmer, you agree?
Sure.
Okay, Dorsey Mill Road Bridge.
Okay, Dorsey Mill Road Bridge, this is a project that was in CIP last year, our last CIP, and it's a new bridge, would be a new bridge over I-270 in the north part of Germantown. It's a four-lane bridge connecting existing Dorsey Mill Road. It's also the alignment for the Quarter Cities Transitway up in that area. The cost of the project has increased by 20% from last year. based on just new estimates, based on construction cost, unit costs and such. The council has asked that the State Highway Administration look at the potential for providing direct ramps from this bridge as well as some others on I-270 to the proposed hot lanes or express toll lanes in the median of I-270. If that were actually to happen, then one of two things might happen. One is this might end up being taken over by the state as part of their project, or if it's not, it'd still mean the bridge would have to be redesigned. So typically I don't recommend delaying projects that have already been delayed like this one has, but I think this one with all the question marks about it, I think delaying it the 3 years that the executive is putting forward here is not out of the question, so I'm concurring with the executive.
So this is over 270?
Yes.
It's a bridge over 270?
Yes. North of Father Hurley Boulevard.
What's that?
North of Father Hurley
North
Boulevard.
of Father Hurley Boulevard. And it's for the CCT,
The northern part of the CCT.
the northern part.
Remember, CCT's in two phases. The first
Right.
phase goes up to Metropolitan Grove.
Right.
The second phase goes up through Germantown and eventually to Clarksburg. And where it crosses I-270 is at this on this bridge
We've always taken a phased approach to the CCT.
for the last 15, 20 years, yes.
Right. Okay. I can go along with that.
I have a question though. So I'm just trying to understand a project that's going over 270 when we're still not quite sure what's happening in 270.
Well,
I think that's council staff's point, is that this is in flux. It wasn't in flux when this project started. There was no proposed express toll lane network on 270. Now there is. This design that is in here doesn't necessarily respond to the function this bridge would provide in that new scenario with express toll lanes. And that's part of the justification for saying, let's not advance this project now, because we don't know that the project we've designed meets the requirements that are going to be in place when it goes to construction.
Worded that way, I agree.
Without objection.
and unless you have any objection, the Glen Road Bridge, I think I already talked
Nope,
about.
you did.
So, okay, highway maintenance projects. Again, the first 6 of them are, I'm calling consent projects. There's really no change to well, these are mostly level of effort projects, so there's no timing involved. And the funding changes are either none or small. And so I'm not recommending any difference from what the executive is recommending on them. Number 2 is the resurfacing residential rural roads project. There's really 3 projects which have to do with residential roads, streets. 2 of them are back under the consent projects, the permanent patching and the residential and rural road rehab. But just the basic resurfacing project, the simpler one, where you basically take up the top layer and replace it with a new layer, is what we're talking about here. The amount in the approved CIP for FY21 and 22 are very low. It's only $2.9 million and change for each of those 2 years. But the reason why it's that low is because the council last year at reconciliation accelerated $10 million out of those 2 years into FY20. So I actually did the work a bit sooner to help balance the CIP back last May. Nevertheless, it's still a low number. The Infrastructure Maintenance Task Force report says we should be spending on the 3 projects together, the 2 that I mentioned under consent and this one, optimally about $49 million a year. And even under the executive's recommendation, if you take the 3 projects together, we'd be spending in FY21 about less than half of that, about $21 million. So I'm recommending approval of the executive's recommendation for this project. But again, even though there's a real need here, reconciliation, we'll do the best we can. Sometimes we actually are able to do more. Sometimes it's less. But at least as a starting point with the exec's recommendation is what I'm recommending.
I agree. Anybody else?
So Go ahead.
I was going to say, yep, recognizing reconciliation, I'm for it.
So I want to use this as the opportunity, the first time in the CIP, so first time discussing the CIP regarding resurfacing. One of the things that we always hear and everyone knows is that our own individual roads get resurfaced and then a utility company comes in 2 or 3 years later, if that, if not sooner, and rips it all up. So explain to me how all this works.
I'll actually ask Randy Pa, who is in charge of that program, to describe it, but there is a coordination process, and usually when they rip it up after we've done it, it's an unplanned emergency utility repair, not a programmed repair. But I'll let Randy talk about how that's coordinated.
Good afternoon, Randy Paul here. Several years ago, we were mandated to coordinate our projects with the respective utility companies. We partnered with WSSC. We created an APC software tool where we post 3 years of projects into the future, planned projects, not necessarily funded. The utility companies do the same thing. So since then, things have gotten a whole lot better with conflicts about us going in and resurface a road, then they come behind us and have open cut, trench, and patch. Now, we have a system to where we rate our roads by pavement condition index every couple of years. Every utility company has their own system to do the same thing. So if we pave a road and they come behind us and perform their survey, then they have certain priorities that come out of their survey, like a gas leak. And because of public safety, they have to go in and trench and repair that infrastructure. Typically, after we pave a road, it's under a 3-year moratorium unless there's that emergency. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I had not known about the 3-year moratorium, but unfortunately, most of us see or think at least that it happens more frequently than that. And so I appreciate you sharing that there's a more coordinated effort. I'm not sure people think it is as coordinated as it might be,
Actually,
myself included.
If I may, it actually goes beyond us. Department of General Services, when they accept permits for maintenance, when those roads are all resurfaced, we've partnered with them, and they also go under a 3-year moratorium for the new roads.
That is helpful, and of course you all acknowledge the reason I'm asking the question is we want to be good stewards of our taxpaying dollars, and anecdotally and firsthand evidence would suggest otherwise. So
We have no shortage of utility emergencies, so that's kind of
Yeah.
why you see that situation.
okay.
Randy, are we now at a point where all the utilities are signatory to that agreement?
No.
I thought Washington Gas was not.
WSSC, Washington Gas is slowly getting into it. In fact, there's
What is
IT
that?
issues, for the lack of a better term, for them to be able to access the software through their
Right.
systems.
Didn't DPS design a
But-
tool they were all supposed to use?
Correct.
Okay.
It's WSSC developed, we helped develop it with them,
Okay.
and we're still partnering with them.
Washington Gas doesn't use it?
They do, but to a certain point where there's limited access to be able to post their projects in that system. So besides the software, we still have quarterly meetings with them every 3 months. We have constant communication with emails and messages and their key staff about our projects. So, for example, if the council has been great when we have accelerated funds, well, our projects are posted in there. That helps smooth the road, no pun intended, about coordinating the utility relocations. If there's emergencies like that come up and we haven't paved yet, then it leads us to coordinate memorandums of understanding with them so that they can go in and open trench and do their utilities, and we take their funding to pay for the mill and overlay, which benefits us. We take that funding and move it to another project that was in the program.
I thought, right, last time the former DPS director was giving us a briefing, I thought we were told that all the utilities were using the tool except Washington Gas, right? Now you're saying they're using it, but their software doesn't.
It's been very slow go.
is somebody writing an API or something that would allow the
Say
software?
they're at an earlier stage. You're just getting into it and trying to ramp up, I think is what Randy's saying. But they are now engaged in it.
Is the nature of the problem that their software doesn't communicate with ours?
It's expensive. You have to get into different software and licenses and getting through the company's servers to be able to use the information. It's complicated. I'm not prepared to explain those issues today.
But your
But,
quarterly meetings or the workaround to,
Washington Gas isn't the only one. You got Verizon, you got Pepco, you've got other ones that are encouraged to be part of it. There are less utilities in the county than some of the other ones that's under the pavement, but you still have those conflicts as well. And we encourage them to participate in these quarterly meetings as well.
and do they?
Yes, yeah. Those meetings have grown from a handful of people, and now there's 50 to 60 people attend those quarterly meetings
And
from all the agencies.
without the tool working properly, you compare spreadsheets or something side by side?
That's exactly it.
Okay.
It's kind of an old school method, but it still works.
Right.
And personal contact, talking to them through the telephones and these meetings and emails, it solves, rough roads. I mean, it smooths the way to get the coordination that we need.
Are all your analogies highway related?
Yes.
And under county law, my understanding is the utility is required to restore the road to the state it was in before the utility arrived, correct?
Yes.
So constituents watching at home that see examples where that has not been done should call 311
Yes.
and bring it to your attention. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
DPS manages most of that restoration work, but yes.
Right. Okay. Okay. Mr. Orland. Sorry.
Okay, the next is the sidewalk and curb replacement project. And the exec is recommending increasing this program by about 17% over the 6 years, the last CIP. So it's a very significant increase. Part of what's happened here is that in the last couple of years, DOT has done a more complete survey, and they haven't done this in years really, as to how many sidewalks and curb and gutter is actually their responsibility to make sure that they're taken care of. And they found that actually there's, instead of about 1,000 miles of sidewalk, it's really closer to 1,700 miles. And curb and gutter increased from about 2,100 to 3,300. So if you're thinking in terms of how much sidewalk and curb and gutter should be replaced annually, and typically sidewalks and curb and gutter last about 30 years on average. So maybe a little bit more if there are repairs that are done regularly along it, regular repairs. Then that means we should be replacing optimally 56 miles of sidewalk and 111 miles of curb and gutter every year. And so the cost that we should be putting forward by the Infrastructure Maintenance Task Force report is about $11.5 million for curb and gutter and about over $4 million for sidewalk replacement. So the executive's increase does make a dent in that. It's still quite a bit less than what is optimal, but it is in a positive direction. So I'm recommending approval. And again, it's the same kind of thing based on reconciliation. Maybe we can't do quite as good as this, but we should certainly do better than what's in the approved CIP.
Right. Mr. Conklin, have you sent out a press release alerting pedestrian safety advocates that we actually have 600 miles more of sidewalk than they thought we did?
We're preparing to release the findings of the sidewalk inventory very shortly.
Great.
Yeah, and this was in
People should be
response,
overjoyed to hear that.
partially in response to the Vision Zero program, knowing that we had unknown sidewalk conditions, and we're doing repairs on a complaint-based basis, which was not effective in meeting these needs. So we have much better information about that now.
The sidewalk inventory began from the open data mapping of all the sidewalks, which began because of the sidewalk snow removal initiative. And I was very optimistic that once you began to map all those sidewalks, that would lead to better understandings and more refined approach and new opportunities to, and so it's great to see that coming forward. in this budget here. I guess we're going to get later to new sidewalks, that program, or is that, did you not actually bring that out?
I didn't bring it out because oh, no, that's in the next, that's
That'll be the next session? Okay.
Right.
Good, I'm glad to see this. Appreciate this
I
request.
think it's great that the survey is completed, and it's terrific, and as is the additional investment in the residential and rural roads. So, yeah, I think without,
Mr. Reamer's too modest to say this, but actually the original idea for the inventory was his. So
I thought that's what
it
he
was a
said.
council.
That's kind of what I was saying.
Yeah, but I
my own way.
make it really clear.
Thank you.
Okay, so on to road projects. There are a whole host of them where there's really no change. The funding has not changed, and the timing has not changed. So of those 11 projects that are listed on top of page 7, unless there's something you'd like to talk about, we'd go on to the next item.
objection.
I do want to point out that the last three, the 3 White Flint projects, are all to be funded by the White Flint Special Taxing District, and I've raised this before. The taxing district is not paying for its projects. It's at least very little of it. Most of it right now is being paid for through advances from the general fund, and I know finance and the executive branch have been working on trying to figure out a way of digging out of that hole. They're not quite ready yet, but hopefully in the next month or two, we'll have proposal from, or at least options from them as to how to do that. But right now, we're about, I think, Allison, we're about $20 million in arrears. Is that right? Or Dennis?
Yes, about 20 million.
About 20 million and growing.
Yes.
So it's a long way away. Okay. There are also 3 projects I want to highlight that are not in the CIP that have been in the past. The highway noise abatement project and the dedicated but maintained roads projects are both ones which are based on citizen requests or neighborhood requests, and they've been dormant for the last several years because it's difficult for a neighborhood to actually provide the funding that they would be required to put forward, even if the county makes it easier by putting up front the money and having them pay off over time with like a special taxing district. It just really hasn't happened. In the case of the highway noise abatement, the only thing we've ever built under this program were some noise walls along Shady Grove Road near the ICC more than a decade ago. And the only project we've ever built under the dedicated but maintained roads project was the reconstruction of Fawcett Road, which is a local street in Potomac off of Falls Road. And so I encouraged this last year. I'm hoping that this can happen maybe in the next 2 years, is that DOT can look at these 2 programs and decide should they be scrapped, or should the policies that might lead to projects coming out of them be revised to make it so that there might be more takers for either of these kinds of efforts. Again, there's no money recommended in the CIP now, and I'm not recommending there should be, but there was actually a lot of work in both of these programs to try to get them going and have them available, but they just haven't been taken advantage of for the reasons I mentioned. The other thing I want to mention was Montrose Parkway East. You recall last year the council, executive recommended the council agree with defunding it. It was over like $130 million that was taken out of the CIP. What was left was $1 million to have DOT look at a study to see what possible smaller improvements might be made to address at least part of the problem that was Montrose Parkway was going to solve. That work is underway. It's a traffic study being done by the University of Maryland, and hopefully they believe they'll have an answer on these studies by sometime this summer. So the work is being done on this. It's just not ready yet. Okay, the next project on page 8 is number 3 is Bethesda CBD Streetscape. This is a project that's been in the CIP for 20 years, and nothing has been built. This was a requirement of the 1994 Bethesda Sector Plan 26 years ago. There were 3 or 4 CIP-related items that were required in that plan before Bethesda development can go from stage 1 to stage 2, one of which was to program the streetscaping along 3 sections of road in Bethesda: Wisconsin Avenue in the northern area, Woodmont Avenue, basically between Old Georgetown Road and Norfolk Avenue, which is that one block, and a short block along East West Highway. What's happened over time is that there's been a little bit of design work, but no construction. And it's always been a low priority of the executive and the council. It continually gets delayed. And in the meantime, development along those roads have been required by Park and Planning to do the streetscaping that the county would otherwise be doing. So effectively, this work it hasn't been done yet, but much of it has been done, and more is being done every year by private development anyway. So my recommendation is finally just to get rid of this project, and once the development in downtown Bethesda along these 3 sections of road is finished, and there's not going to be any more, if there's some small gaps left, then maybe we can come back with a project. I'll have to say, 2 years ago I made the same recommendation. There was a blowback, as you might expect, from the Bethesda Chamber saying, no, we want to hold out hope, it's going to happen, or if not, let's just take that money and use it for some other streetscaping project. And what I said then, what I would say now is, if there's another project, then it really needs a new PDF. One of the suggestions I heard just earlier today was, could this money be used for the Norfolk Avenue redesign? And the Bethesda sector plan calls for Norfolk Avenue to be made more of a pedestrian bike-friendly street by changing the width of the road, maybe changing the pavement, doing all kinds of things along Norfolk Avenue to make it more of a mixed street,
Woonerf.
not necessarily a one-earth, but a complete street.
Shared street.
A shared street, thank you, a shared street. And in fact, the council added money to this facility planning PDF, I believe last time, to do the planning for exactly that. And the money is programmed in the existing CIP for fiscal years 22 and 23, and we'll talk about this next week, but the executive's still keeping that schedule. Same money, same schedule.
Is there a PDF for that project?
It's in facility planning. It's one of the facility planning studies. And within the facility planning program,
PDF once you finish the facility.
once you finish facility planning, it becomes eligible as a project. And so if it follows that schedule, then it would actually not be the next full CIP, but it would be the amendment year after that. It would be ready as a project.
Could we
Accelerate it?
Just create a PDF and move this funding over there?
I really argue that you shouldn't do that, because first of all, it assumes that this money somehow is related to that money. You might as well move this money to some project somewhere else.
There's another Bethesda project that we've received a lot of communication about.
This is only $900,000, by the way.
Which doesn't close that gap.
Doesn't
But
close that gap.
nonetheless, there is another project in the CBD.
And that's part of this, what's happening with your review of the CIP. You add projects, you subtract projects. In the end, you have to sort of make it all work within the revenue that's available. Now, I would say is if you're not going to do the specific scope of this project, then delete the project and then come back when you have another project that's ready. And the Norfolk Avenue one will be. If you want to accelerate the Norfolk Avenue study, you'll have that opportunity next week in the facility planning program to talk about it. Again, it's competing with other things in facility planning and other things, but that's something you could do if that's something that's important to you. At the very least, if for the optics, which I hate that word, but if the optics is you don't want to get rid of this project, then I would at least say take that $900-some thousand into fiscal year 25 and 26 and push it out where all the rest of it is, which is beyond 6 years. And that way you can still say it's in the CIP, but you're not putting aside any money within the 6-year period to it. That's my backup recommendation.
I agree with Glenn. We have lots of urgent.
Option 1 or option 2?
So I would suggest that we, I don't think we have to make a decision now on the streetscape. I think it would be probably fine to get rid of this streetscape if it's being replaced by something else, and I would be fine with the Norfolk project. So I would say we ought to see if we can do that. I also think that if at the end of the day we're successful in getting enough money back into this budget for the tunnel, people might be accepting of the need to have moved around a lot of money, and so it'll be a little it's a chaser for something that you whatever the phrase should be. I can't really come up with that right now, but so I think it might be wise to just kind of, I don't know, punt, but let's keep working on this, and then I think we can put something together that people are comfortable with, but not have to say, sorry, we're just taking this out right off the bat.
I should say, even though you're making these straw votes today, obviously you don't make the final decision on CMP until May, but to get closer to finding out what the nature of the problem is, it's good if you can make sequential votes as you go along. Unfortunately, with the Capitol Crescent Trail Tunnel, we're not taking that up until late April. So we won't know until then. We won't know then what the committee would like to try to do. And of course, we
So
won't know.
my position would be, I think we should create a Norfolk PDF. I think we should move this funding there. And at the end of the day, if we still need even that money to accelerate the tunnel, I'm okay with that also. So that's sort of a 1, 2, 3 for my position. I don't know how that fits with this. I would say don't remove it for now because we don't have this other PDF in front of us. I think we could punt on this issue until next week as well, and it'd be fine. So that would be my
Mr. Glass,
suggestion.
you're the swing vote.
Oh, am I? So I appreciate the thoughts that Councilmember Raymer just shared. I don't know if necessarily that sequence is required. I don't necessarily want to replace this with another streetscape project. What I would like everyone to be mindful of is that we are trying to fund things that aren't adequately funded. And so in order to do that, we have to remove certain projects. And I would rather not remove this project with something else and then remove that project for something else. And let's cut to the chase, if we're using shot chaser kind of analogies. I would just rather cut this project and let everybody in the Bethesda CBD know why we're doing it, and it is for another project that everybody really likes.
In addition to that, I would not even think it's accurate to call it cutting this project. This project is largely getting done, and it's getting paid for by private developers, which
Excellent
is great.
point. Yep.
And all the taxpayers of Montgomery County and all the residents of Bethesda should rejoice that the project, unlike many other deferred projects that are health and safety projects around the county in needy neighborhoods, this one's actually getting done, and even better, developers are paying for it. So we're not deferring and kicking the can down the road, but we've got $5 million parked there that we can't spend on other things. So the project's getting done. We should, I think Dr. Rowland's right, we should take it out and spend the money on things that need it urgently.
I mean, that's not only the private investment, but the fact that this money's been sitting there. I mean, how often, I'm here 14 months, but, okay, well, how often is money just sitting there that we haven't been using? I'm not familiar with many other instances in county government.
It's never been in a current year. It's always been sitting at the very end of the CIP.
Okay.
Right.
So it keeps getting, so in our own plan, it keeps getting kicked
we
down
would
the
like to
road.
put
Yeah.
something else there as a constituency.
So what are the options? Option 1, option 2?
Take it out or put it in, leave it in.
Take it out.
I think we're all in agreement about what we're trying to do here, but I am going to say that was a 2-to-1 vote, narrowly.
Okay, observation drive extended. This is actually it might be useful to look at the map on Circle 7, just to make sure we're oriented as to what we're talking about. This is a extension observation drive, which is a 4-lane divided arterial coming out of Germantown, going across Little Seneca Creek up to West Old Baltimore Road, and then a little further to the north. Eventually, we go all the way to the town center. This project is in 2 phases. The first phase is what's in solid black there on your page. It goes up to just north of West Old Baltimore Road, where Little Seneca Parkway, which exists about 2/3 of the way west of 355, would be extended over to meet it. And the entire road would be a 4-lane road from Observation Drive, where it ends today, all the way back to 355. The second phase is the dashed line, which goes through what's planned as the employment corridor in Clarksburg, but which there really hasn't been any employment activity for the last 20, 25 years, but ultimately will be. It's a very expensive project. The overall, both phases is $115 million, $116 million. The executive this is on page 8 and 9. The executive is recommending delaying the start of design by 1 year. It was delayed last year as well, but delaying the start of construction by 3 years. This is, I believe, a very important project because it provides much better access for the folks who live at the south end, particularly of the Cabin Branch neighborhood, which is west of I-270 along West Old Baltimore Road, and also for folks who live in Clarksburg Village and Aurora Hills, who otherwise have to come out to Route 27 and fight their way down along there and Father Hurley Boulevard to get over to 270. This is also, at least the piece along Observation Drive up to the town center, is all the right-of-way for the Carter Cities Transitway, and is one of the possible alignments, in my mind, probably the best alignment for the 355 North Bus Rapid Transit line. So it would get the right-of-way for that, although it wouldn't build it. So I'm recommending not accelerating, just not delaying it. And so the expenditure schedule is the bottom of page 9, which is $65.5 million within the 6-year period. And that's $42 million than what the executive had. The executive had, by pushing the project out, particularly construction, had reduced that down to about 24 million. So that's my recommendation. Stage 2 is the $50 million that you see beyond the 6 years, the last column. And I think that should wait until the employment corridor actually becomes more of an active thing, because you can see of that cost, nearly half of it is land cost. And if that area develops, then we hopefully will get most of that land through dedications, and it wouldn't cost the county. The land cost for the Phase 1 piece is only $1.5 million. It's a very small part of the total cost. So that's the rationale for not accelerating Phase 2, but going forward with Phase 1. And I think you received a letter from Councilmember Rice supporting this.
Okay, I do support this. We are challenged by the infrastructure needs of Clarksburg. There's no question about it. And that's across a whole wide array of infrastructure needs.
You support restoring it.
I support restoring it. There's council members talking about building a regional aquatic facility in Clarksburg. That's probably 50, 60, 70 million dollars. There's talk about a library. That's probably 30, 40 million dollars. We have several parks. One is 15 million dollars. One is 8 million dollars. There are a lot of needs there, but I really believe transportation is the one that the residents there feel the strongest, and that we ought to put our first dollars towards. So I know it's a bigger item, but I have always supported Observation Drive extended. I think it is a good project, and I think we ought to do our best here. I do think we need to meet this commitment if we possibly can. So I really recommend we keep this on track, and I agree with council staff.
Mr. Conklin, just to be fair to the exec, do you want to explain the planned delay in something that's been in the CIP for a while?
The executive has been consistently supportive of providing additional transportation capacity to Clarksburg as well, and it was just an issue of fiscal constraint, given the scale of these expenditures, to slide it out 1 year. The sequencing that Dr. Orland has described is completely logical.
Mm-hmm. And there's nothing you learned about the
There's
project?
no new information that's informed that decision, no.
Councilmember Less.
Oh, I was waiting for your thoughts.
My thoughts are very much aligned with Councilmember Reamer. Everybody in the up-county, the number one issue everybody needs is transportation. And not everybody's going to swim in an aquatic center. Not everybody's even going to go to a park. And you have one of our largest parks up there, if not more than one. So I think this is a project that, has been waiting for a very long time. Those residents have been waiting a long time for it, and I'm hesitant to delay it, and I agree with council staff.
As do I. There are a lot of transportation issues that we need to work through regarding residents in the up county and residents of Clarksburg in particular. and whatever we can do to bring them some relief as quickly as possible, I think is the right thing to do.
Okay. And I have to hasten to add again, at the end, we have reconciliation, so hopefully we can stick to the schedule, but
Right.
the best we can.
Yep.
Subdivision roads participation, these are projects where it's a level of effort project, but basically what it is when there's a road improvement that a developer is required to do part of it, the county oftentimes will add more to it to make it a more complete road project. And there's two of those in Clarksburg, as it turns out, right now. Actually, there are three, one's finished. Clarksburg Road and Snowden Farm Parkway, the intersection, and Clarksburg Road intersection improvement at Merwin 355. The costs on both of them have gone up since the last CIP. They do recommend approval.
Without objection.
Okay. The last set of projects are traffic engineering program projects. The first 6 of them are, again, projects where there's no change to the funding and no change, well, they're level of effort projects, there's no timing involved.
Can I ask a question on this one? Where are we on the advanced transportation management system? That's the smart signals, right?
It's a lot of things. Go ahead.
No change. No funding change, no timing change.
Is there any funding?
Yeah. Michael Paolo, Chief of Traffic. Hi, how are you all?
Good.
Right now, the ATMS program is ongoing, so we're continuing to,
What's the current level of effort?
you mean as far as
Funding.
funding?
It's,
For ATMS, $1.5 million
I was going to say 2. Right, okay.
Per year or over the 6 years?
Yeah.
Per year.
per year.
per year.
So, how much of that is for the smart signals?
Those funds are for maintenance of the traffic management system. There's no enhanced adaptive signal proposed in this.
Aren't they in the traffic signals project?
So we did one, the first demonstration project, which is down along the Montrose Road corridor, was done about 2 years ago. We have identified other corridors, but due to capacity constraints with current revenue, we have not been able to fund additional. We do have another project in the works that we're partnering with State Highway on. When the governor announced his statewide smart signals initiatives, we worked out with the state, the 108 corridor up in the Olney area, that we would partner with them. They haven't got that project itself scoped out, so nothing is programmed, but we would work out a funding arrangement with them. I don't know if we'll need any appropriation. It'll just be, billings to the state or whatever.
Okay, well, I can explore after the meeting as a follow-up, but I'd really like to see if we can't, add something for the smart signals. It's just a long-term issue, and, we got to bite the bullet and do our best every cycle and add to that, because it is really important, so.
Emil, do you know how other jurisdictions compare on that issue, on their investments?
In terms of
Are they
adaptive
investing in
signals?
smart signals more than we are, less than we are?
So, Michael's our chief traffic engineer, but I'll let him address and jump in as need be.
Because you can get back to me, but do you know how, is DC or Arlington or Fairfax heavily invested in this? Or have they looked into it and given up on it?
Of
Or
course, they're looking into it. I wouldn't be able to tell you specifically whether or not it's more than Montgomery
Yeah.
County. I'd say that, it's comparable.
I would say, from the information that I'm aware of, only about somewhere in the order of magnitude of about 2 to 5% of the signals in the entire U.S.
Right.
are to the degree of adaptive signals. In fact, Montgomery County is probably a power user in terms of what we do with our signal system. Most jurisdictions would be set them and forget them. We're very active in real time with constantly tweaking the signal timings. The adaptive is another level of technology and sensors, kind of monitoring patterns in real time and letting the signal self-adjust. It is very sensor intensive, therefore more maintenance dollars and attention is needed to it. And a lot of jurisdictions do not go to that level. In this area, I think Arlington did some, Arlington or Alexandria, one of the A's, but generally speaking, only about 2 to 5% of the signals nationwide are probably adaptive.
DC is predominantly pre-timed.
Yeah.
So DC is predominantly a pre-timed system where there's not a lot of adjustment because of the unusual characteristics of that street network with the diagonals and grid. These have been tried by VDOT in Fairfax County, but the places they've tried them were generally over-capacity roads, so they didn't see a lot of benefit. These really have the most benefit when you're a level of service CD. You have spare capacity and you're doing your best to allocate it, not so much when you have severe levels of congestion that these systems don't add much functionality then.
Or off-peak times when you can actually float the signal cycles down to meet demand.
And that's certainly one of the challenges that DC is going through when they're looking at and trying to move forward with an adaptive program, but because of the lack of capacity on their roadways, they're having, the difficulty or constraint there, so.
Right, okay.
What does it cost per signal?
If memory serves, the project we did on Montrose was to the tune of about 900,000, 1 million, somewhere in that range. I'd have to go back into the CIP and see what it was. And that was about, Mr. Reed, yeah, we'd have to follow up to double check what our numbers were there and what some of the initial estimates when we did the very early study on it.
Okay, thank you. This has been an area of interest for me in the past, and I have worked to try to add funding for this. I think the Montrose funding was added at T&E, and if it's possible, I'd love to see us continue to try to press forward on that. Even minor investments can add up over time if you consistently make them, so thanks.
Any other questions about the consent projects? Nope. Okay. Intersection spot improvements, the executive is recommending an increase of about $4.5 million in this program, which is a host of small improvements, usually adding a turn lane or that's sometimes it's for traffic capacity, sometimes it's to improve pedestrian visibility and that sort of thing. The sub-projects are in Circle 8. If you look at Circle 8, you'll see them all listed, and where you see a bullet annotated on the left, those are all new projects that are would be included in the program, and you see the years in which the money would be spent. And of course, those are all in thousands of dollars, and it explains what the nature of the improvement is. And so I do recommend approval of the executive's recommendation on that.
Objection?
The next is the pedestrian safety program. Come on down, Maren. This is the program which is the heart of the Vision Zero construction program, if you will, where typically what's happened in the past is there's been a lot of high-incident area locations where accidents have occurred more frequently, and DOT then does a study to figure out what needs to be done, and then they actually fund them out of this project for the most part. There's also some money in here, I believe, also for education purposes. The executive is recommending a large increase here from $13.2 million over 6 years to over $23 million. It's a 75% increase. And I'm recommending that you agree with the executive. Also, what's happened in the last year and a half is in the planning board's work program, you included money for a Aspen Hill Vision Zero study. It's not a master plan, but it's a study which looked in detail at the area right around the commercial area of Aspen Hill. And the leader of that was Maren Hill, who's here, and Carrie Sanders from Park and Planning as well. They're bracketing DOT on this one, keep
them honest.
Surrounding them. And they have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to try and tee up again now. So talk a little bit while I try to do that.
Thank you, Glenn. While Glenn's getting that set up, just wanted to introduce you a little bit to this project. We will be coming back to the full council to do a briefing shortly. So we'll keep it short today. We know you have a lot of items to cover. I'm Carrie Sanders. I'm the chief of Area 2 in the Planning Department. And this project was added to our work program in fiscal year 2019. And the study was added because there are a high rate of severe and fatal crashes in the Aspen Hill area, particularly over the last 5 years. And the study area includes 2 of the county's high injury network road segments in the study area and 2 equity emphasis areas as designated by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. So those 2 key factors made this an important part of our work program. And as I mentioned, you will be seeing this study. Here's the cover of it. It will be transmitted to you shortly, probably in the next week or so. And as part of that, you will have a letter from the planning board, which just emphasizes some of the aspects of that study that the planning board considered. I also wanted to mention, while we're getting this set up, that the planning board, as they reviewed this, as they approved this, specifically asked for funding for the improvements listed in the study. The funding was broken down closely with DOT to have short-term actions that could be more within the right-of-way, could be lower cost, but could have high impact. So that was broken up into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. So in your packet on page, let me pull up the page number for you, Circle 10 and Circle 11 and Circle 12, you'll see that we've broken up into short, medium, and long. I do want to note that, of course, many of these projects are on state roads because a lot of our crashes happen, our severe and fatal crashes happen on state roads maintained by the State Highway Administration. So certainly as we worked with DOT, we kept that in mind, and we understand that this would have to be something that would be partnered with the state. And fortunately, we did do a lot of outreach with the state on this project, so they're familiar with what we're recommending and have been involved. So.
Question?
Great, go ahead.
Circle 10, no turn on red restrictions. Do you have to do a study? Is that why it's $100,000?
So these are estimates, and I certainly will defer to DOT, who prepared the estimates for us. But typically, a sign is about $150, however, like a standard traffic sign. However, some of other costs are included in this, such as if there are signal timing changes needed. And we have grouped some of the costs together with other costs. So even if for instance, we have some locations where we have grouped, let's say, the markings, the crosswalk markings have been grouped together with some of the signage improvements. But to answer your question, no, one sign is not going to cost that. It's the cumulative cost of all the project itself, including the markings.
First of all, I really like this project. Applaud DOT for proposing, the county executive for proposing it. I think we need to be doing more of this kind of work, and I'm really enthusiastic about the kinds of treatments that we see. We're starting to see them more in Montgomery County, but I think we could do a lot more. With the little picketing to create safe spaces and to direct cars and to help drivers focus on the road and drive safely. And I would like to see us do a lot more of that. And it seems like maybe this is where you have envisioned some of that to happen, or it could happen here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. I mean, there's obviously need in Aspen Hill. We continue to see the fatal and serious crashes there even just this fall. And we would be looking to implement projects like those recommended in the study in Aspen Hill, but not exclusively in Aspen Hill. We have similar experience on 355 in Germantown, Gaithersburg, Middlebrook Road in Germantown, in Rockville, 355 area also. So we would be looking to use these dollars to do the types of improvements that are called for in this plan wherever we can get them done most expediently, so that we're having them impact with the dollars as early as possible. So when we run into issues with drainage or right-of-way availability, we may not do those first just because that slows us down too much, and we have plenty of opportunity to do the smaller scale projects countywide, because these needs are countywide, not just Aspen Hill. But this study did a good job of categorizing what the issues are and strategies to address them, similar to some of the work that's been done by us for the BIPA program or as part of the pedestrian road safety audit programs, which come up with similar recommendations. So we're supportive of incorporating this into the program, whether or not they all happen within the funding that's currently requested or not remains to be seen, because we want to spend this money everywhere that the need is, not just in one location.
What's the blending here between the Vision Zero Aspen Hill study and the capital budget before us?
Well, there's about $1 million of county attributed costs in those tables.
In the Vision Zero tables?
For the Vision Zero study, and, the funding increase here was something like 10, so theoretically, we could do all of this, although, we have a large county with these needs everywhere, so there's not a direct one-to-one correspondence, but the idea was to increase this program to address these types of needs, like the study identified, and use these studies as the roadmap for where to focus our energy.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out, this was a great project that we did with DOT. I think Andrew Bussey, who's here, was very helpful with working with us on this, as well as Mr. Conklin and SHA. And if we could just give you a quick snapshot, I see we have the PowerPoint pulled up. If Maren could talk you through a couple of the outreach strategies we did, I think that would be helpful for the committee to hear.
I also want to point out that both Andrew Bossy and John Hubler, who's in the audience, were very helpful throughout the study process, and not only as technical advisors, but coming to some of our engagement and meetings throughout the process. I won't revisit what Carrie already mentioned for why we picked this study area or the boundaries of this study area, and some of you guys might know that Aspen Hill is this area that's bound by wide roads, high-speed roads. It's very auto-centric, and it has a lot of low-density development. And because of that, we've also seen a number of severe and fatal crashes, 24 severe and fatal crashes just since 2015 in this small area. Despite it being a small area, and despite the vehicle trips making up a large percentage of the person trips in the area, one thing that you can see from this graph is that the fatal crashes involving pedestrians and bicyclists is actually rather high. It's 56% of all of the severe and fatal crashes have victims that are bicyclists or pedestrians. And I think what's interesting to note here is countywide, we see that severe and fatal crashes, 27% involve bicyclists and pedestrians. In the rural areas, it's only 5%. In areas that we would characterize as having a suburban pattern of development, it's about 25%. And in the urban areas, which are within a quarter mile of metro, or places like Silver Spring and Bethesda, we see 50% that involve bicyclists and pedestrian. And Aspen Hill actually has a crash rate that looks more like these urban areas, where we'd imagine in urban areas you see people walking and biking a lot more. And I think that suggests that we're missing some of the infrastructure that protects people who are walking and biking in the area, that we're missing some of that infrastructure. Okay. All right, I'll just wildly wave my arms. Waving my arms now. So a big part of this, as Carrie mentioned, the study area is comprised of equity emphasis areas, and we tried to provide or look through an equity lens when we were examining both the issues and also looking at potential solutions in the area. We started with the premise that everyone should be able to move around their community safely, but as we've seen many times, there are certain populations that are disproportionately affected by crashes. And in this study area, some of the characteristics that make Aspen Hill unique, that make it diverse, are also the areas that, according to county data, make it more likely to have these severe and fatal crashes. So, for example, there are higher incidents of severe and fatal crashes in areas with higher rates of poverty, with people of color, with people who speak English as a second language, as well as young residents. These areas tend to have higher rates, collision rates, compared to the rest of the county. What we've also seen in Aspen Hill area is that there's a high bus ridership compared to the rest of the county, so we have people frequently crossing these very wide, high-speed roads. And not only did we look at the issues from an equity perspective, but we also set out to create our engagement strategy around reaching an incredibly diverse group of people. Aspen Hill is very diverse. It has a large Spanish-speaking population, as well as many other groups. And how we did this is we held traditional meetings, but we also held a number of meetings in pop-up locations on weekends, both in the evening and during the day. We offered translation at all of our meetings and translated all of our materials into Spanish. We also offered children's activities at all of our meetings so that people with kids could come and take part. And we really believe that this allowed us to reach people who wouldn't traditionally come to a meeting and have conversations. We had Spanish-speaking staff at all of the events as well, in addition to the translation. And also at the planning board hearing did provide translation as well. So as Carrie mentioned, we worked with DOT and our community advisory group, which was a 12-member group that helped with planning staff, to identify issues and then potential like menu of solutions to these issues, and categorize them into short, medium, and long-term, which I believe are in your packet. And these are just the short-term improvements that we mentioned. One that is not included in the packet is the relocating school bus stops from these high-volume, high-speed roads. Aspen Hill was the site of the tragic crash on Georgia Avenue 2 falls ago. And we're now working with MCPS to look at how we can evaluate and move some of the bus stops. So in terms of next steps, planning staff presented to the planning board and consulted also with MCDOT, and the planning board recommends that Aspen Hill Vision Zero improvements be added to the pedestrian safety capital improvement program and specifically used in the Aspen Hill study area because of its high need to support this like equitable and timely implementation of these, in many cases, very urgent improvements. No more hand waving.
And MCDOT is agreed.
Now, like I said, we're not specifically allocating these dollars, but the plan is the roadmap to the improvements we would make in Aspen Hill.
Yeah, the DOT did for us a breakdown of the general idea of what the costs would be that are being recommended by the study. And you'll see them in the packet on circles 10, 11, and 12. Circle 10 is our short-term treatments. And you see for each of them, the cost is broken down between what is really should be a state cost because they're on Georgia Avenue or Connecticut Avenue, and some are county costs, and some are split. Given the situation, there may be a mixed intersection or that sort of thing. And you see that of the $700,000, that's the cost of the short-term improvements, about $116,000 would be county, and the balance would be state. Some of this might actually even be operating expenses rather than CIP.
The state's already agreed to that?
Pardon me?
The state's already agreed to this split?
No, this is the guy.
It's a proposal.
This is a proposal.
That's what I thought.
But the
It's not a proposal, it's the components that are on their infrastructure. So it is their responsibility to do it.
Under our current practice.
Yeah, whether or not the county ends up supplementing that to get it done faster is a different question, but it's their responsibility to do it.
right. That's what we're trying to show here. In the medium term, about 90% of it would be a state responsibility. And the longer term really are not things that would be necessarily included in the CIP, at least not in the first couple of years, is $10 million or $10.6 million worth of work. Again, the overwhelming amount of that would be state responsibilities. And as Mr. Conklin mentioned, that oftentimes we have to step in to do things that the state really ought to be doing.
Thank you for the presentation and all the thoughtfulness that has gone into this. So my question was about like shovel readiness, right? And so I guess that would be more applicable to the short-term treatments. Are they shovel ready, or are they still plans and designs?
So we intentionally, when we worked with DOT to come up with the short term, we tried to do things exclusively inside the right-of-way, and I realize that sometimes that's the state right-of-way. But things like pavement markings, signal timing changes, signage, that's what we are in the bulk of the short term. So to answer your question directly, we don't think that the short term would require extensive like facility planning. It's more of hopefully these things that could be done quickly. The one thing that's in here that may require a little bit more facility planning is the bicycle plan recommendation for the side path, which it's the very last item on your Circle 10 chart there. It's listed as bicycle master plan recommendation side path and 6-foot buffer on east side of the sidewalk. So that is connected to our Matthew Henson Trail and is all a project that's still within the right-of-way, so doesn't widen the road, doesn't cause us to have to remove trees or anything like that, but is something that would require some conceptual level design. But the other projects, such as, median, restriping, those type of things, those are more short-term, low-hanging fruit for safety.
Yeah, things that we need to get done and get them done as soon as possible. Right. The only other question I have is just for you to explain to me, if we stay on Circle 10, high visibility crosswalks, and I understand that those are state roads, right? Intersections at major roadways, but what goes into a high visibility crosswalk? What's the distinction?
So basically, the county has adopted, and now the State Highway Administration as well, a certain type of pedestrian crossing pattern that we call the continental pattern, which is a wider perpendicular striping that provides much more retroflectivity for drivers who are approaching an intersection. And then also there'd be the additional signs that we would place in the right-of-way, the state stop for pedestrians in the crosswalk. And then also some of the initiatives kind of behind the scenes that may not explicitly be spelled out here. We're talking about high visibility crossings. We're also talking about the potential, the possibility of beaconing or signalizing those intersections too. So all of those things kind of in a pot would constitute a high visibility crosswalk.
Yeah, I appreciate the acknowledgement of signaling and all that, including their lighting as well. Aspen Hill, I was there when that beacon signal was opened, and I know that's an important, as short as that intersection might be, that simple crosswalk, I know how important that is getting from one shopping center to the other. And so in your description of that community, there is that urban walkability, which is probably why the incident rate is more reflective of downtown Bethesda and downtown Silver Spring as well. So I totally understand that. But as we continue thinking about this, and I know we will have a more in-depth conversation on, I think, pedestrian issues next week. Is that correct, Dr. Rowland? Yeah, so I'll save much of my conversation for then, but recognizing that we know and we keep being told and we keep seeing that the same old isn't working, and so thinking that we can continue putting more striping on the roads when people aren't even looking at the roads, we need to do better, and so we'll engage more in that conversation next week. Thank you.
What is the status of conversations with the state about doing something altogether?
I'll say ongoing. We've been, in our coordination with the State Highway Administration, we've been emphasizing and impressing upon them the need to enhance crossings with more than just markings and stripings. And the State Highway Administration, in turn, has been going back and looking at how they can do that. And so they have their internal processes that they're trying to navigate through to make them more compliant with our Vision Zero, our vision for Vision Zero. And so that's ongoing.
And there are other elements on specific projects. We're working on sidewalk design and construction on Veers Mill Road, and there are specific state-county partnership projects that are in development.
But is there a Aspen Hill, joint project that's in development, or you're talking to them more generally
So I
about?
wouldn't say a joint project, but there are some level of effort projects that we've been looking at, lighting on Connecticut Avenue in Aspen and some other places that we've been talking to the State Highway Administration about the need for them to be involved and do that work. And those conversations have been taking place over the last several months.
We'll be getting their context-sensitive design standards soon, and I imagine that those would support these changes.
They've released those for use and as a draft, like version 1.
Okay.
So they shared that with our pedestrian bike traffic safety committee at their last meeting and went through it in detail, and they're applying that already. And I know they've had conversations with the city of Rockville about applying those standards on 355 to increase the frequency of crossing opportunities there as well.
But wouldn't it, I mean, don't you want to ask them, hey, can we do something together? Like, you've got funding here for the county's component of the Aspen Hill changes. Obviously, it would be best to persuade them to do something at the same time.
Yes, we do that routinely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's your plan? Okay, great.
Just picking up on that point, real quick. So SHA, former Administrator Slater, is he officially the Secretary of Transportation yet, acting? Either way, when he was SHA Administrator, came here on an occasion and explained the 6 different zones and the rethinking. And is that part of this conversation as well, recognizing that not all state highways in Maryland should be treated the same?
That's a change in their thinking. Yes, we've always taken a context-sensitive approach here, so it's not necessarily new to us. But yes, it is seeming to give their staff more flexibility in the tools they're willing to consider in these areas.
And right, it is our leadership and advocacy and political inertia that has gotten them to evolve in their thinking. You're
And I
absolutely
think a
right.
stark look at the facts on the ground in front of
Yeah.
them and the types of crashes they're seeing in the suburban districts.
Right, and so, but the bottom line is that while we've been trying to implement those, the process is now easier to get that sign off. If it's,
When we're in conversation with them, they are referencing those guidelines and referencing the new flexibility they have to use those tools.
beautiful, thank you.
The only thing I'd say in terms of a follow-up to this is, although it's pretty late in the game in terms of the executive developing his operating budget recommendations, one of the things that maybe the department could do is just go back and look at these, particularly the short-term recommendations, and to see what extent, when we get back to the operating budget in about a month and a half, what specific things might be able to be incorporated in the FY21 budget. And if it means some of the stuff that would otherwise be state, you'd have more time for conversations with the state, and we can bring this back up then. Okay, well, thank you. I apologize for the technological mishap. Last 2 projects, page 11, street lighting. The executive's recommending basically the same level of money per year for street lighting. The 6-year total is going down quite a bit, however, because we're just finishing up a major program to replace the street lights to LED, and that's getting finished basically in FY20, so that big expense won't be showing up in the 21 and 26 CIP. On Circle 13, you'll see the latest priority list of where infill street lighting will occur from 1 through 20. And the department takes into account a lot of factors in developing this priority: crime, pedestrian activity, proximity to schools, rec centers, a host of other items, those being the most critical, probably. And then the final project is the White Flint Traffic Analysis Mitigation. This is sort of a follow-up to the White Flint Sector Plan many years ago. Most of the work has been done, but there's continuing work really annually on monitoring cut-through traffic in the area around White Flint to make sure that the development there isn't causing problems in neighborhoods like Lux Manor, Garrett Park Estates, et cetera. And so the executive is showing $81,000 annually for that effort. And that's it for today, unless you all have anything else.
Well, I just want to add just one quick point regarding the streetlight priorities. In looking at that on Circle 13, the road with the most number of lights to be installed is Mid-County Highway, number 4 Mid-County Highway with 100 lights. And tying this conversation back to the one that we just had about pedestrian infrastructure, about 2 weeks ago, a resident was killed on Mid-Highway, just crossing. And we know that that is essentially, a suburban highway, but the lack of lighting is what led to the circumstances. And so we need to remember that they are tied, and while there are different budgetary items here, they're all towards that same goal of making sure that our roads are safe.
Could I ask real briefly, what's the relative role of state highway versus the county on streetlights on state highways? I know we've done streetlights on state highways. We did some on New Hampshire Avenue a few years ago.
The state generally does not do continuous lighting on state roadways. They do on the interstates in the urban areas, then they change the, generally speaking, interchanges and as you get out of the urban areas. We do go to the state because sometimes they will do individual spot lighting for locations, but typically if it's continuous lighting, like the sidewalk paths, they rely on the local jurisdictions for that.
That's all I got.
Great.
Before we wrap up, I'd just like to acknowledge that we received your correspondence yesterday about the 29 next stage BRT improvements. We'll be prepared to speak about that when we meet next, and we'll hopefully get you material in advance of that work session so that we can have a more robust conversation.
In advance of the
Our
BRT
goal is to get it to you
conversation?
before the 5th.
Okay.
Right. All right, terrific. Thank you all.